Superman, the face of comics, Kratos, the icon of PlayStation. I've gone over both of these characters in the past on this channel. Those were some of my first videos, and due to being a power scaler, my perspective and opinion on things are bound to change over time. Getting straight to the point, I will be using Superman's Rebirth variant for this matchup, given that he's emerged at the post-Crisis and U-52 iterations into one being. So no alternate versions or Elseworld versions, only the main continuity of DC Comics. Dawn of DC is still a relatively new initiative that came out in early 2023, following the events of DC's latest Crisis event in Lazarus Planet. So, respectively, I won't be using any feats from the many storylines being published during this initiative. The version of Kratos that I will be using will be from God of War 2018 and Ragnarok, as the Norse saga is the continuation of the ending of God of War 3 and the events of Fallen God. There are certain aspects of scaling that aren't applicable for obvious reasons, but most of the innate hacks and speed feats are applicable to this version of Kratos. I might get into All-Stars and God of War 3 Kratos versus Cosmic Armor Superman later in the video. Kratos' appearance in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, a crossover of all things PlayStation, or at least try to be, has a direct reference in God of War Ragnarok, meaning it's directly acknowledged in the primary storyline of Kratos' overarching story, making it more than a typical crossover, unlike, say, Marvel vs. Capcom, or certain Soul Calibur games, which take place in their own separate canons. The connection has been confirmed to be canon to Kratos' story by multiple writers, Cory Barlog and Matt Sophos, so any feats of strength in it, since the canonical intricacies carry on to God of War 3, is applicable and will be used. By the time this video comes out, my buddy Rogue may or may not have a video on his channel in a more targeted and verbose sense, explaining the entire situation and intricacies regarding All-Stars and God of War, rather than being limited to constraints of a versus battle, so go watch that if you haven't, if it's out. The infamous clash between Golden Age Superman and post-Crisis Superman in Infinite Crisis that not only threatened the universe they were fighting in of complete annihilation, utterly shattering the boundaries of its space-time, as stated by both Supermen, but that their clash alone was shaking apart the fabric of the DC universe. This is impressive because taking Rip Hunter and the Wanderer statement into consideration, there are an infinite amount of universes in the DC universe that rest inside the bleed, which is the space between universes in DC Comics. And these universal levels or multiversal levels of warping is consistent due to Superman literally warping and bending reality by any means to simply see Lois Lane again. Superman's Rebirth variant would scale off of these multiverse threatening and altering forces as a general baseline due to many statements indicating that he is quite literally as strong as ever. This is true given the fact that in the early issues of the comics in Rebirth, Superman is able to contend with a fifth dimensional imp in between and out between quantum space-time, conjuring the infinite planet where any and all realities is possible. We do also know that universes in DC Comics have infinite timelines due to every decision in the main continuity spawning a new universe. Leary's statement from Our Worlds at War, searching the infinite timelines and the references to Schrodinger's cat theory and many worlds interpretation actually existing being confirmed by Dr. Manhattan in the comics. Then there's the infamous controversy of the size of individual universes, or if the bleed contains spatial characteristics beyond just 5. Higher dimensions do exist in DC Comics, but not in the way most people claim, with it being in regards to the greater multiverse rather than being a 17th dimensional or something like that. New gods like Metron and Darkseid both give us explicit statements on a 28th dimensional nature of the greater multiverse, not just all of this somehow existing in the bleed. Hell, the Wanderer even stated that the multiverse is beyond the cosmic membrane, which is the bleed being literally described by other gods like Hercules to be a membrane between universes. The next statement many people go for is the Ren Makusha statement, when not only has it been confirmed by the writer of DC Universe Presents that her statement wasn't in reference to higher dimensions, but if you actually read the storyline, you know this isn't about higher spatial dimensions at all. The dimension or universe Ranma and Deadman were in had its own rules with time operating as a malleable force, and is described as the infinite moment between a life poorly lived and the agonal state of death. It is subjective experience of that moment in a realm or dimension with its own rules. This whole storyline tackles existential and metaphysical themes, with Deadman or Boston Brand at the focal point of it, and it never really explores higher dimensions like what most people actually claim. For Kratos, I think it's necessary to clear up some misconceptions about his general scaling, because I don't think people understand why Kratos is so powerful. What you'll find detractors saying on the message boards or forums is that the notion of the Well of Fate, or the Home of the Norns, contains infinite timelines, and that the idea of infinite timeline as a whole was retconned in God of War Ragnarok, and is just a random lake the Norns live in. This ridiculous assertion is blatant misinformation and shows the lack of knowledge many have on this matter. The producers from the God of War card game, in their very first announcement on the official site, provided a description of how the Norns gaze and have access to these timelines, saying, looking deep into the swirling waters, they can foresee what potential combination of heroes, villains, battles, victories, or defeats might stop the end of all that is known. We also know that from the description of the back of the box, that the Norns gaze into the Well of Fate, and that within its waters, after gazing into it, not only see endless future possibilities, allowing them to play out many timelines of events, but also endless combinations of heroes, villains, battles, etc. The mystical waters in this well serves as the medium to gaze into and access these timelines. It doesn't inherently contain anything. It's never described like that in the card game, nor is it portrayed like that in the actual video game when we do see the Well of Fate. Think of the device you're on right now, the actual screen which you're watching this video on. Doesn't inherently contain the content you have or watch on, but it is the medium through which you can access and experience the content you want to watch. This applies to the Well of Fate. But these quote-unquote timelines are greater than a general timeline for a universe because it's the duration of time, past and future, for all 9 realms. Midgard being how Scavandians see the living universe for mortals, with every other realm being its own parallel dimension to that, as the realms you could travel to in the main timeline show in the game are in the endless amount of timelines in the card game, and you can experience events entirely different from the main game. In the power scaling community, we call instances like this a hyper timeline, where multiple 4th dimensional space-time continuums abide by a higher form of time. It's basically 2 temporalities at play here. The time for each individual realm and the time the structure of the realms all follow. This would make each of these hyper timelines 5th dimensional in nature. There's also the fact that when Kratos enters the Light of Alpheum, he enters what's described as a otherworld in the official strategy guide for God of War 4, a distinct dimension from all 9 realms, with the Light of Alpheum being explicitly stated by the narrator in the novelization to transcend all the contents of a realm. I needed to establish this because Kratos scales to Thor, who was able to completely break the Yggdrasil of the Norse pantheon. This is shown in both of their fights, with the second one having Thor completely enraged at Kratos, fighting with the intent to kill, and Kratos coming out on top. And taking Freya's statement into consideration, we know that the Yggdrasil's existence supports all of creation and that every strand of the tree transcends time and space. This transcendence naturally includes the realms themselves, the infinite amount of hyper timelines, and by extension, the other world. Within the Light of Alpheum, while the Light of Alpheum transcends the contents of the realms and operates as the force that separates them, the Yggdrasil's role, as I've just blatantly described, goes completely beyond just mere separation and actively sustains everything in the Norse universe. We also know that a branch of the Yggdrasil stretches out to infinity from the novelization Infinite 7th Dimensional Scaling, or what we call Complex Multiversal in the power scaling community. God of War being a franchise that didn't really release its games in chronological order until the Norse saga of games, has a category of speed feats ranging from infinite to the immeasurable speed ranges. In God of War Ascension, which is Kratos' weakest iteration due to the game chronologically, was able to perform a feat of counteracting the temporal manipulations and effects of the Amulet of Ouroboros, with the amulet being stated to control the flow of time entirely, reveal past and future events, and show the life and death of someone. This is blatantly temporal manipulation that goes beyond a linear progression, rather than, say, for example, manipulating the time axis. Of course, this is Kratos' combat and reaction speeds, not his actual travel speed. Kratos can't just run at immeasurable speeds on some Barry Allen or Wally West but he can react to and counter temporal effects that operate that fast. Unless you think moving in the realm between realms warrants a form of immeasurable speed, which we know Kratos and many other characters can do, though that's a different discussion entirely, and I'll leave that up for your interpretation. This probably makes you wonder why he has prolonged fights against not just fodder enemies, but against the Furies or anyone else in this after the chronology. Well, to put it bluntly, the Furies individually are all powerful and skilled in their own right, being the literal incarnations of law and order for the entire Greek universe, being capable of utterly washing Atlas-level threats in seconds, with Kratos fighting the strongest two, Electo and Tisiphone, at the end of Ascension in a fated showdown, so naturally they prove a challenge either way. And at the end of the day, it's just a video game. There needs to be a challenge for the player and a balance within the game to make it flow a certain way. It's fresh into 2024, and people still argue that when it comes to video games that have a disconnect on what is told through the lore versus what's actually visually being shown through the mechanics and game design, without any proof to assert the latter interpretation is the objective one. You obviously can't show Kratos' true power without it just being a planet-busting simulator, universe-busting simulator, something. The Man of Steel, just like Kratos, also has a category of speed feats ranging from infinite to immeasurable speeds, and since he's a merge of the post-Crisis and U52 variants, the speed scaling should be comparable or function the same off of his post-Crisis variant. U52 is kinda shit, but Superman in the early days of Action Comics was sort of able to keep up with Superboy while they were just flying back in time, though albeit still struggling due to barely being able to hold on to Superboy's leg. There's also the fact that Silver Age Superman just straight up flew back in time trying to alter history for Lori, preventing the sinking of Atlantis and the death of Krypton. I mentioned these feats because in issue 1050 of Action Comics, which is during the Rebirth era, the Man of Steel states that certain concepts have largely lost their meaning in regards to his existence, two of these concepts being distance and space-time. This is interesting because not to say largely lost meaning equals a superiority over said concept. It still implies that certain constraints that we in real life are bounded by are irrelevant to Superman. We can't just cross an infinite distance, or we can't just go to different points in time. But with this statement, it's not too plausible that this version of Superman can do these type of feats effortlessly, unlike post-Crisis, for example. But this would just be his flight speed and reactions, not his combat. It isn't as cut and dry as, say, the Viltrumites, who have flight speed feats interwoven with combat speed, being able to consistently fight in combat while flying this fast. Whereas Clark and most of his immeasurable speed feats, really all of his flight speed feats are mostly performed in a more streamlined and aerodynamic position. Now, to compare and contrast the feats in speed, seeing that there is a massive difference in AP, it mostly leans towards the God of War's favor, even being generous to the Man of Steel and scaling him to the entirety of the bleed, using the statement from Superman Beyond, saying he can contain the bleed, the space between universes being described as a structure in the fifth dimension, not to be confused with Snyder's interpretation of the fifth dimension that exists literally everywhere in the multiverse, even though that's not what the statement says at all. In the context of the scan and granting the entities who are suffused with the energies of the orphan boxes actually honing fifth dimensional power that transcends space-time, the difference between Kratos and Superman's power would still be that of a level of two infinities, with those levels each being inaccessible to the other. But speed-wise, he might have an advantage with his flight speed, given that it's immeasurable, being able to fly back or forward many years in time. If the Man of Steel utilized his flight for this fight, and this creates a weird argument, while Kratos can't fly that fast as he's not someone that flies, he can react to temporal manipulation operating that fast as we established earlier. On top of that, he has fought various individuals among the God of War universe that straight up just specialize in flight. If Superman were to just fly at Kratos and punch him, nothing's really gonna happen. It'll be like running straight into a brick wall, and at most he pushes him back a little. However, if Superman were to fly straight at him and resort to abilities like his ice breath that he can span around Kratos, or his heat vision, he may have an advantage, but it's highly unlikely this will do anything substantial at the end of the day, given the sheer difference in power. Kratos wields blades that are suffused with the primordial fires of chaos and can generate flames in a realm so cold that fire ceases to exist. And there are instances of Clark's heat vision working potentially on the Planck scale to even fixing tears in space-time. Kratos would all in all deflect these lasers exerted off of his vision with his bare hands, given that he could physically close realms' tears with them, and these are explicitly stated to be tears in the fabric of reality, or space-time. I doubt that I need to be on this point for too long, but Kratos is far superior to the Man of Steel in the realm of armed and unarmed combat. There are certain issues with Superman being proficient with a sword in post-Crisis, but it's just not the level of Kratos' weapon mastery. He's a more skilled and experienced fighter, being a martial artist on top of his weapon mastery, has a far better arsenal that grants him abilities he'll have access to during the entire fight, better innate hacks and resistances to overcome just about anything the Man of Steel offers to the table. I didn't mention the feat of Superman just completely one-tapping the World Forger after an unknown amount of sun dips, which ended up destroying his new multiverse due to how circumstantial this entire sequence of events was in that specific issue. But if you think Superman would just fly out into space or something and not only ascend beyond imagination, which exists beyond all of creation, dwarfing it in comparison, but just sun dip into all the stars in the nearest constellation and reach these plot-induced levels of power that anyone who thinks universes in DC are these hyper-versal to infinite dimensional constructs, regardless of the many consistencies throughout every era regarding the nature of said universes, then he would most likely one-shot the God of War. Though it's kind of edgy because this is like the only instance where he was ever amped to this degree after absorbing the radiation of stars. But what about the more stronger versions of these characters? During Superman Beyond, Kal-El and Ultraman merge into the transcendent thought robot, Cosmic Armor Superman. After the merge was complete, we're shown that the realm of Limbo, a featureless realm above the sphere of gods, and where matter and memory breaks down, isn't even as big as his palm. This is naturally due to the Monitor Sphere being a fundamental and primal world existing at the very edge of creation, completely beyond the material multiverse. His battle against Mandrake, the literal entropy of evil, destroyed a good portion of the Monitor Sphere, as shown in the background of the scans, and this is impressive because this is the most fundamental and primal plane of creation in the multiverse that even surrenders to the Overvoid itself, yet they weren't able to reach it from clashing alone. Monitor Mind, the Overvoid, the sentient space that signifies the white page or blank canvas of a comic book page, is consistently characterized as a space of non-duality, beyond the source wall or main DC multiverse, being a place beyond place, and the ultimate concept that contains multiple dualities like life and the anti-life equation, good and evil, and even extending into spatial coordinates like up and down, in and out. This would mean that Monitor Mind, the Overvoid, is beyond the confines of spatial characteristics on a conceptual level, and beyond conventional identification since concepts have no distinction and separation here. If we take Grant Morrison's statement onto the matter in consideration, with all of this in mind, this would make Cosmic Armor Superman outerversal. Polygon Man, who is the embodiment of the entire PlayStation brand, and his power lies at the center and base of the PlayStation universe, being not only stated to control the energies of the PlayStation universe, but also that nothing can exist without him in his voice lines in the actual game, which I'll play for you here.
This is not the end. None can exist without me. I shall return. The energy of this universe is mine to manipulate.
The PlayStation universe, for those wondering, is quite literally stated to be the world or software inside the console, signified by the XMB power waves floating in the background. And this makes sense because in the actual game, when All-Stars reach Polygon Man's domain, or the PlayStation universe, there are multiple rival cutscenes with non-exclusive characters interacting with PlayStation exclusives. So for the skeptics that say it's just Sony's IP, that were to actually be the case, these rival cutscenes with non-exclusives and exclusives physically interacting with each other cannot happen. We also have a direct answer on what the PlayStation universe encompasses in the context of cosmology scaling for All-Stars Battle Royale by the game director. So given that PlayStation 1 and 2 characters are present in the game like Sir Daniel and Parapara, the rapper, the game itself being released on PS3 and PS Vita and taking Omar's statement into consideration, the PlayStation universe encompasses every PlayStation game from the PS1 and PS2 era, and every game to come out on PlayStation 3 and Vita due to the scaling being applicable to characters and games that have yet to release after All-Stars came out. Since hundreds of games on the PS3 and Vita came out after it's released, you can't use PlayStation 4 or 5 games within the context of All-Stars due to these systems not being applicable to the merits of the Polygon Man scaling. There are many franchises existing in the PlayStation universe, with one of them being Shin Megami Tensei, and its main continuity having cosmological structures in these games, like the Akasha Stratum, in Devil Survivor 2, where spatial coordinates cease to exist on a conceptual level, or the Quantum Sea of non-existence in the Avatar Turner novels, for the Quantum Devil saga that's completely beyond identification, and Ego on a conceptual level where everything is just one big eye, being a place with no up or down, and being above the concept of dimensions entirely. And this is just the Shin Megami Tensei's cosmology and its novels canon to those games, existing as literally just a few of the gaming experiences inside of the PlayStation universe. or the world inside the console out of thousands of games Polygon Man's influence and control encompasses, like Marvel vs. Capcom, the DMC games, at least the ones that came out on PS2 and 3, Dark Souls, multiple Dragon Ball games, and almost every relevant Nasuverse game, so I think y'all understand just how busted this can really get. The Thought Robot might be outerversal, with arguments potentially getting him a few steps deeper into it, but Kratos defeated a being who controls the energies of a realm that's unreachable to any outerversal hierarchy in the cosmology of a game existing in the PlayStation universe, which the many games between the very PlayStation all the way to the very last games on PS3 and PlayStation Vita that we know and love are all contained in. Within the context of PlayStation All-Stars, PlayStation Universe being present the moment a console is turned on and being the foundational digital structure for the gaming experience on a PlayStation, period, is something completely unreachable and beyond the scope of any outerversal hierarchies within the games that have this level of cosmology in the PlayStation Universe. This would make Polygon Man high outerversal, and by extension, Kratos scales to this. He would then go to absorb his AP orb, which would be an amp on top of the amp Hope gave to his base stats at the end of God of War 1, with Kratos completely eclipsing these levels of power at the end of 3, when he utilized the full power of Hope against Fear Zeus. This version of Kratos would utterly one-shot Cosmic Armor Superman, and it's not close. Some will bring up these statements in regard to the Cosmic Armor Superman being in a hyper-assembling story and that he can adapt to any threat instantly. For one, that type of counter borderline treads a no-limits fallacy, and two, he wouldn't be able to adapt to someone who is completely unreachable to him in terms of existence and power. It would make sense that this adaptation is in reference to any threat and is specific to your power and what the story of Superman can handle at the time, rather than this narrative being absolutely across all of fiction. On top of that, the PlayStation Universe just has better cosmology scaling than the DC Comics, unless future storylines during Dawn of DC show us something really big. So when everything is said and done, PlayStation's icon comes out on top, if this fated duel between him and Cosmic Armor Superman was to ever occur. Detractors will resort to a hasty generalization of appeal to authority and assert the claim that Polygon Man or even the director of All-Stars has no control or authority over other IPs, then bring up the real-world, legal, authoritative positions within a fictional context of the cosmology scaling in the PlayStation universe. The people who assert these claims don't really understand the context of the scaling, as it's literally stated that Polygon Man represents the entire brand of PlayStation, not just certain territories of the brand like PlayStation in Japan or PlayStation in Europe, who Sony gave the green light to Omar Kendall, the director for All-Stars, to use as the final villain. If you try to limit his influence to these games on what is just visually shown, you aren't really looking at the full scope of things. Plus, Omar's authority on other verses legit doesn't matter, as not only is he not responsible for any of the IPs in the game, but they already exist in the PlayStation universe. What Omar was responsible for was the portrayal of Polygon Man and describing what the PlayStation universe actually is. It is verbatim stated that Polygon Man's role in the PlayStation universe is having complete control over it. That is a canonical thing that he can actually do. But yeah, big shout out to my guy Rogue for being a huge part of this video, helping me with Kratos knowledge and scaling. In the past, many have had to rely on questionable scans to even get Kratos this high, but this is a much more concrete way of Kratos reaching this level of power in the context of Kratos amassing whatever he can do to achieve his vengeance against the gods of Olympus, with multiple writers who wrote Ragnarok directly confirming this connection. Anyways, thank you so much for watching if you made it to the end. It really doesn't go overlooked. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and bye.